Welcome to the Casa Central podcast. This time we're taking over the episode of Casa Café Chats. My name is Amy Garcia de la Vega, and I'll be your host on today's podcast titled Domestic Violence Awareness Month, Staying Safe at Home. With me today are Stephanie Scherer and Alexandra Garcia, both therapists at Casa Central's Violence Prevention and Intervention Program, also known as VPI. They will be with us here today to explore domestic violence in the times of COVID-19. But before we start, I would like to explain a little bit about what the wonderful VPI team does. VPI provides domestic violence counseling to victims and survivors. They also offer the Safe Start program, which provides family therapy for young children ages birth to 5 who have been exposed to violence. If you would like more information on VPI or other programs offered by Casa Central, please visit casacentral.org. Topics discussed in the next 45 minutes are deeply personal and sensitive, which may be difficult or triggering. We ask that everyone attend to their physical, emotional, and mental well-being as they listen to the podcast. Remember, you can always pause and step away as needed. I also want to note that today we will be utilizing the pronouns he when referring to the person that harms and she when referring to survivors of domestic violence. There are 2 reasons for this. Statistically, more men are perpetrators of domestic violence than women, and also for clarity's sake, as sticking with one pronoun causes less confusion for everyone. However, it's important to note that not all perpetrators are male and not all survivors are female. So, to start this podcast, I would like to address one of the biggest questions that I have when talking about domestic violence, because when I hear domestic violence, I really think about someone isolating or manipulating or harming their partner. And whenever I picture that happening to me, I always think I would leave. If I saw a red flag or if someone hurt me, I would like to think that I would just walk out that door. But what we're seeing now, and really what's been going on, is that the majority of domestic survivors aren't leaving, they're staying. And as someone outside of that abusive relationship, I have a hard time understanding why. Why would someone stay?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And first and foremost, I just want to say I'm excited to be here and to chat with you today.
Thank you.
So I think thinking about that question really requires us to take a deeper dive into what is domestic violence. And I think as a society, a lot of times we think of domestic violence just as physical abuse, but it really is so much more than that. Also, it's important to note that domestic violence is often interchangeably with the phrase intimate partner violence or IPV. So if we're thinking about domestic violence, the definition or how it's defined is as a pattern of behaviors used by one person to maintain power and control over another person in an intimate relationship. And often these behaviors are characterized in a DV relationship through physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and economic abuse. Some of these behaviors can be characterized through intimidation, coercion, isolation, minimizing, denying, blaming, and more. But I think if we're really thinking about your question, why would someone stay? It's really such a complicated question because there are just so many reasons why someone might not leave and choose to stay. A lot of times, individuals don't even know that they're a victim of domestic violence. And when they find themselves in that situation, it's really hard to see. Control manifests slowly over time. It doesn't just happen overnight. And I think additionally, physical abuse is not the only means of abuse present in a DV relationship. So if someone is like, well, they just talk to me, kind of poorly sometimes and really demean me and make me feel intimidated, but they don't hit me or they don't hurt me. So I'm not in a DV relationship. And a lot of times that's, a situation where it's a moment to educate the individual on what the different types of domestic violence really are. I think too, in DV work, we think of abuse as a cycle. So the whole time period of abuse, it's not always an explosion, right? We have what we call a honeymoon period where, someone's really nice and they apologize for what happened and, maybe they blame themselves or they give you gifts. And so you sort of tell yourself, well, this only happened once, it won't happen again. But then you find over a few weeks, maybe some tensions building and they're getting upset and they're angry or they're yelling and ultimately that ends in another explosion, right? Maybe they attack you or threaten you emotionally or sexually and then we kind of go back to this honeymoon period. In that case, it's hard to see, right? Because it's not all the time. It's only every once in a while as we're cycling through this abuse. I think too, one of the primary reasons someone doesn't leave is because of the danger involved in it. A lot of times, the most dangerous part of a relationship is when a survivor tries to leave. A lot of times we refer to power and control when we think about a perpetrator. And essentially, power and control means using different sort of methods to assert that power over a victim. That, includes, like I mentioned earlier, isolation, intimidation, often using children. And when a survivor, chooses to leave, they're essentially taking that power away from the perpetrator. In these instances, a lot of individuals may retaliate or be physically harmed or even threaten to harm one's loved ones. I think it's important to note that there are definitely groups that are more vulnerable, including, members of the LGBT community or undocumented survivors, and also individuals with disabilities or language barriers. I think that many survivors navigate these threats alongside other things. DV isn't typically the only sort of challenge they're dealing with. And a lot of times there's feelings of guilt or cultural and religious expectations or just fear of judgment from family and friends. And I know that was a really long-winded answer to your question, but I think it's really important to think about DV from a holistic perspective.
No, I appreciate that answer because it's really enlightening, and it also highlights the fact that a lot of times we do have preconceived notions about what domestic violence is and what it looks like. I know a lot of times, even as I'm saying, hey, not all survivors are female, not all perpetrators are male. Even as I say that, in my mind, when I picture domestic violence, I have an image of a couple, and it's a male who's perpetrating, it's a female that's being hurt. And just like me, I feel like there's a lot of people who have these ideas about what is DV and who's impacted by DV. And even now, when you mentioned that members of the LGBTQ can be susceptible to DV, it's not something that we often think about. We're often just stuck in this narrative of male and female in a relationship, and that's that. We're not really thinking about who else is being impacted or what other groups are also capable of experiencing domestic violence. So I did want to kind of go over that. What exactly is the impact of domestic violence on other groups? Who is susceptible to domestic violence?
Thanks, Amy. That's a great question. And before I get to your question, I do want to say that I am very glad to be here today. I think that it is critical that we acknowledge and spend time talking about domestic violence because domestic violence does impact us all. And to get to your question, I think that there's a very common belief out there that domestic violence is a women's issue, right? And I think that there is great danger with that because domestic violence should be thought of and approached the way that we approach any form of violence, right? That it is a human issue. And having this false or inaccurate view of the problem allows or maybe even excuses men from paying attention, right? There's no time to be reflective. In fact, it's very easy to be dismissive of domestic violence if you're a male, right? And that is problematic because statistically speaking, males are most often the perpetrators. And when thinking about the way that we view domestic violence in a more macro scale, it does have implications on how social policies are developed and how society addresses domestic violence. Because I think, like I mentioned before, there is a common belief that there is a typical domestic violence survivor. One of the messages that we want to make sure our listeners take away today is that domestic violence happens to everyone. It happens in all races, all religions, all incomes, all education levels. It's everywhere. Some are targets and some witness the violence. And for me, when I think about witnessing violence, a lot of things come to mind. And one of those is children. About 65% of adults that abuse their partner also abuse their children. And I do want to take a moment to think about the impact of being exposed to violence when it comes to children. What does that mean? I think that we see a variety of things in children when they have been exposed to domestic violence, and that includes developmental regression. And in other words, they're developing backwards. Maybe they're experiencing behavioral issues. And I think that there is also a limited opportunity to develop skills like coping, self-regulation, self-soothing, and just having a hard time controlling behavior, emotions, and thoughts. I also want us to think about how, children view their caregivers and adults, right? They depend on adults and their parents to keep them safe. When they don't trust that their parents can keep them safe, that does have implications because children need to feel safe. They need to trust their parents in order to form healthy relationships, have the ability to explore and interact with the world, and be curious and learn.
Anybody can be a victim or a perpetrator of domestic violence, and that's pretty scary because, like you said, it is a way to remain blind to those situations in daily life, or to even excuse ourselves from acknowledging that it exists in areas that we may feel uncomfortable acknowledging that it exists. But the reality is that right now we're also in the middle of a pandemic, and stress is high, income is struggling, people are scared and confused. You keep saying that domestic violence is about power and control, and I can't help thinking, what's going on now? What is going on? We're in the middle of a pandemic, we're struggling to survive here, and yet domestic violence is still going on. How are survivors being impacted, and what are we doing to help them?
That's a really important question because, the essence of DV hasn't changed, but survivors have now been isolated to a degree that we haven't really ever seen before in our history. The sort of characteristics that we've seen in our participants, prior to COVID, while they're similar, they're also kind of evolving. For example, while a perpetrator may have withheld items before COVID, now we're seeing them withhold, COVID-specific items. Maybe that's hand sanitizer and disinfectants to clean the home. Similarly, we've seen perpetrators sort of share misinformation about the pandemic to control and frighten survivors or prevent them from seeking appropriate medical attention if they do have symptoms. Similarly, this often can manifest as withholding insurance cards or threatening to cancel insurance to prevent survivors from seeking medical attention. Additionally, I think on a larger scale in, Chicago, we're seeing that programs that serve survivors are being significantly impacted. Shelters were full before COVID, but now they're even at capacity. And survivors that are in shelters are scared because they're in close quarters. They can't really leave their rooms because they're scared of contracting the virus. Survivors who have health conditions, heart and lung conditions, are just older, are at an increased risk of being in public places where they may typically have gotten support, like shelters or counseling centers or even courthouses. The opportunities to leave the house now are much more limited. I think, too, the travel restrictions and the bans have really impacted survivors' escape or safety plans, as we often refer to them as. And they might not feel safe, maybe following that plan they had before if that required them to fly or use public transportation. So I think when we think about, how has COVID affected our participants, I think it's really allowed an abusive partner to feel a lot more justified and often escalate their isolation tactics, and sometimes even lying about themselves having COVID symptoms to try and to encourage their survivor to be even more isolated.
I know that we're discussing this a lot about that interaction between partners, about how they're controlling them, and that's alarming within itself. But throughout your whole response, I kept thinking about something that Alex brought up, and that's children. Children, we tend to view them as the most vulnerable people and little people in our population, and we want to protect them. We want to make sure they're safe. But what happens when the danger is in the home? So I see a lot of schools closing, online programs, and partial attendance. And yes, we're doing that because we don't want our children to get sick. We want them to be safe. But what happens when the danger is at home? What happens when one of your parents is being abusive? How is that impacting our children?
One of the words that really resonated with me as you were talking was the word vulnerable. I think children during these times are especially vulnerable. A lot of the supports and social services that were in place prior to COVID are probably not there for a lot of our families, right? And that's concerning because that means that a lot of children's needs are not being met. That also means that there's less eyes on children, right? So those professionals like teachers, school counselors, nurses, doctors, physical therapists that were, having eyes on children don't no longer have access to that. So it is harder to know if children are safe, if children are in distress. I think that is very concerning at this time. For children, they are struggling with isolation as well, right? They're not seeing their friends, they're not able to go to school, daycare, after school programs. They are living in this very closed down environment that doesn't really allow for those very important social interactions that are needed when we're thinking about their development. And also not being able to go to school or daycare, that also brings up some concerns because maybe children view these spaces as safe spaces, right? As spaces where they could maybe not be on guard, not be fearful, and really allowing them to learn and explore. Overall, I'm thinking about, the social piece. I'm thinking about their safety. I'm thinking about, how limited we are as adults and as professionals in being able to provide support during this time.
It's very impactful that there's not enough supports for children and even for adults experiencing domestic violence. There aren't many eyes on them right now. People are really isolated. I feel that as friends and loved ones, we really have to step up to take over and help out the people we love when they're experiencing these situations. But that can also be very hard if survivors are already scared enough as it is to engage in services because the perpetrator is home. Then now how can we navigate those situations? How can we maintain safety and still reach out and ask them if they're okay?
During these times of emergency and crisis, everyone's anxiety levels and stress levels are really high, right? And I think that there's also danger in that because it could mask the reality of what is going on in our loved ones' homes or our friends' homes or maybe a coworker's home, right? They might definitely be overwhelmed by the pandemic and worries about financial and work and family. These signs of anxiety, stress, worry could also be masking the worries about being in an abusive home. And we want to make sure that during these times that we do check in with loved ones that we might suspect might be not safe at home. So I think that one of the ways that we can do that in a safe and non-threatening way is asking very general questions, right? That just like, how's home been like since the pandemic started? What's different now? How are you dealing with being around each other all the time? Do you even get any privacy at home now? Right? And I think what is important what's important that you're gonna learn in these questions or in these answers is that you're gonna get an understanding of what the household functioning is looking like, right? If they answer that everybody's always in the living room, then that kind of gives you an idea that maybe the survivor or your loved one may not be honest and truthful about what's going on because the perpetrator is there next to her or him. Making sure that you're asking these questions to get an idea of how, if they are getting privacy, if they do have the opportunity to talk to you and let you know what's going on, because it will, I think, really dictate how you can support and provide, if that's giving them a number to the domestic violence hotline or maybe keeping some of their items or helping them develop a safety plan. You want to make sure that you're asking questions that are generic and again that are not threatening so that you can get an idea of what's going on in the home.
And now that you say more about how to engage and how to approach, let's say that we do get our foot in the door, that we've asked the right question and we've maintained safety and the survivor has disclosed. Now what? What can we do? I know that you said provide them a number, but what does that look like? What is it that we can physically do to make sure that we're providing the assistance we want?
Yeah, I think that that's a really, really important question because if someone is choosing to disclose to you what's going on at home related to domestic violence, that's so courageous of them, and often you might be the only person that they've disclosed to. Whether you're a family member, a friend, a coworker, you can definitely support a survivor. I think first and foremost, listening to them and validating their experience, giving them the safe space to let them sort of vent and really just remind them that their abuse is not their fault. I know Alex and I have both referenced the idea now of a safety plan, and that's something that we do a lot of times with our participants in our work. And what we mean by a safety plan is discussing a realistic plan. If someone were to choose to leave, what would that look like? From A to Z, what would that look like? What would you need? So a lot of times if they choose to leave their abuser, we think about the important documents that they might need, a driver's license, birth certificates for themselves and maybe their children, insurance cards, passports, social security cards. And I think that this is really important to think about. And, maybe it's not having a box at their home, but maybe they would feel safer to have it at a friend's home or a neighbor's home. And I think just when someone does disclose to you, encouraging them that if it's safe, to sort of engage in activities with family and friends outside the home without their perpetrator present, so they have space to safely talk about what's going on. I think on a macro level, a lot of domestic violence services and agencies are, funded by donations. So if you have the means and are willing to donate, that's a really, really good way to support, either a family friend that is a survivor of DV. You can also volunteer at agencies. I know that might not be a really suitable option right now with COVID, but in the future, or even if you see resources related to shelters, sharing that on your social media, on your Instagram or your Twitter or Facebook, are all really, really great ways to create awareness about DV. I think overall, if someone discloses to you that they are experiencing DV, encouraging them that they're not alone and there are resources for support that they can engage in. Here at Casa Central, our VPI program also works with DV participants. So we are definitely a resource that the community can utilize.
Yeah, going into that, I would actually like to share some of those resources that you were mentioning. One of the biggest would be the National Domestic Violence Crisis Hotline. And I do want to highlight that that's available 24/7 every day of the year for anybody who'd like to call or chat or text. So if you don't have the privacy to make a call, you can always text them. And their number is 800-799-7233. I also want to point out for anybody who's living in the Chicago area that there is a legal resource available. And if you'd like to call the number 312-325-9467, there's a dedicated team of legal advocates who are there to assist you with any legal questions you may have regarding to domestic violence, especially when it comes to orders of protection. And of course, like you said, there are many other agencies. I know Casa Central is wonderful, and also places like Wings and Sarah's Inn, who are just as dedicated and who may be geographically closer to you or may assist you in different ways. So it's important that everybody out there take the time to explore their resources. Alex, I know that we may have some Spanish-speaking viewers out there. Would you mind sharing these resources in Spanish for us?
Tenemos unos números telefónicos de utilidad también. La línea de ayuda nacional para violencia doméstica es el número 800-799-7233 y la línea de ayuda de Chicago para violencia doméstica es 877-863-6338. Si necesitan ayuda legal, también el número que tenemos aquí es el 312-325-9467. Si necesita asistencia o hablar con una asesora legal, el número es 708-689-3422. Y también es muy importante que recuerden que todas las organizaciones y las agencias siguen abiertas y pueden ofrecer servicios. Una de estas agencias es, claro, Casa Central, Sarah's Inns y Wings.
Because we really want to make sure that as many people out there as possible can listen to this podcast and have those resources. And please, if you are listening and you identify yourself as a survivor of domestic violence, please reach out. There are supports out there. There are people willing to help. And if you aren't a survivor of domestic violence, but you want to help or you know somebody, please spread these resources. Post them. I know Stephanie said use social media. we just want to make sure that we get that across, that even in the times of COVID-19, nobody's alone. Everybody out there is trying to help. But with that, we do conclude our podcast of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, Staying Safe at Home. I do want to thank everyone for tuning in today. And I would also like to thank you, Stephanie and Alex, for joining us and for all the wonderful work that you do to engage with survivors of domestic violence and child witnesses of domestic violence. You really are raising the bar on engaging with survivors and making a difference. And I really, really want to thank you on behalf of Casa Central and survivors for doing that. And of course, I also want to thank you for spending time with us today. I know you have a very busy schedule, specifically because of this pandemic, so thank you for that. I'm looking forward to meeting both of you again and everybody tuning in on Wednesday, October 28th for the Casa Central podcast, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, Conversations with the Community. And this time we'll be exploring resources and supports being offered here in Chicago and the surrounding suburbs. So if you know about anybody who's suffering domestic violence, if you just want to know a little bit more and share that information, please join us.
Thank you for tuning in on another episode of Casa Café Chats. To watch this episode or any of our previous Casa Café Chat podcast episode, check out our page on Microsoft Streams or tune in every other Wednesday. All resources listed on this episode will be linked below. Thank you for tuning in. Stay healthy and stay safe, Casa.